I'm Eric Kaplan. I'm the founder of Hatteras Island Ocean Center, which is where you are. This is a new venue we've had called Beacon Place, and this is the first event we've ever had here. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for Professor Horton for giving this presentation. And thank you for Maggie for really pulling this, Maggie Dawson for pulling this all together. I hope you all will come back and visit us another time and or spend some time with us this evening. We're going to keep open for about an hour or so after the program. We have a really nice set of ecology exhibits next door. And over the next few weeks, we'll be gearing this place up. We've got programs we'll be putting in place, kayak nature tours, and things of that nature, things for adults, little kids. We've got interns coming to run programs this summer. This room will be filling up with exhibits over the next few weeks. So we're pretty excited about it. Hopefully this becomes an important destination in Hatteras to promote ecotourism and bring more life to Hatteras Village. Not just in the summer season, but in what we call around here the shoulder seasons. And part of our grand vision also is just a couple hundred yards up the road, we hope sometime to build a new fishing pier that will kind of be along the lines of Jeanette's Pier. So that's the grand vision. But today we start with this wonderful program. And my job is also to let you know that we're not-for-profit, we have no money. So we have a donation box. If you feel so inclined to feed the donation box, that would be great. And there's something else, another way that you can help us test is we're trying this new kind of mobile phone pledging technology. If you feel like texting the word DIG, which was not chosen at random, that's in tribute to this particular program, and you text that to 41444, then magic things happen on your smartphone, and you have the option of making a donation that way. So let us know if you try that, and if that works or not. We had some problems with it early this morning. With all that said, I give you your speaker, Professor Mark Horton, who's going to teach us about 10,000 years on Hatteras Island.
Oh, great, thanks a lot. You get the machine to work, that would be a good start.
I think the projector will come back to life.
Okay, right, well, just to say, first of all, this is part of a two-part talk, and what I will do today is talk a little bit about the very long and really interesting Native American history here on Hatteras Island that we've been uncovering over the last 5 years with a number of amazing sites and fascinating stories and extraordinary finds. Could we get the lights off, do you think?
And we don't know how to turn them off without turning off the power to the projector. So, now you're tall.
Can we swivel them, do you think?
You can swivel them, yes.
Henry, you're tall.
They're hot.
Yeah. You can swivel. Yeah.
They're hot. Grab one
Yeah,
of
they
those
are
bags
hot.
and use them.
They are hot.
Grab the bag.
Is it alright to use the bag?
Yes, it won't burn it. I did my shirt.
Okay, I should carry on.
It won't burn the bag.
Okay, so this is one of the two-parter,
There you go.
and
Straight down.
Straight down. Straight down.
There you go.
how's that?
Fantastic.
Brilliant. And this is part of a two-parter. And on Friday, we'll be talking about the story of the lost colony and the possible evidence that we've uncovered for the presence of the survivors of the Elizabethans who tried to establish a colony here on the Outer Banks between 1585 and 1587, and the survivors who historically recorded came here to Hatteras Island. So I'm not going to say much about the lost colony today because it will be revealed on Friday. Where is it, Maggie, again?
Avon Firehouse.
Avon Firehouse, right. So today I'm going to tell you about the Native American story, which of course is what it's really all about, this very long and incredibly interesting history on this island. And really, I think that of all the places in the whole of North America, on this island, there are probably more archaeological sites that tell this long story of 10,000 years of occupation in one small area than there is anywhere else. Because as we've been doing our survey and our excavations, so all these amazing new sites have been popping up all over the place. And it is a wonderful story of how people have reacted with the environment and also the changing environment, and how they've been able to exploit the natural resources that are here in a sustainable way over a period of some 10,000 years. So I just want to start off by, as it were, slightly framing what we're talking about by just giving a couple of images about when man first came into North America. Because there's quite a lot of new scholarship here. And as you can see from this diagram, there's an arrow that's kind of ought to be pointing straight at Hatteras Island. In between, whilst people going down to Florida and people going up to Cape Cod, but you can see that this is absolutely in the direction of this very early human migration. There's a lot of controversy about when people first settled in North America. Some people have got sites claimed as far back as 30,000, some have claimed 20,000 in various places. But the most secure and the consensual evidence now is that people came into North America through an area known as Beringia, which is this area here between Alaska and Siberia, sometime in the region of around 15 to 13, 12,000 years ago, depending whether you were high chronology or low chronology. And this was a time in which the sea levels were sufficiently low, and this is a theme that we'll come back to in a few seconds. The sea level was much, much lower at the end of the Holocene, at the beginning of the Holocene. The Ice Age was very near. People could walk across from Asia into North America. And also, the ice was beginning to dry, it was beginning to melt, which allowed a corridor from the Great Shield in Alaska to open up and people to come in down into the North American area. And this route has very much been confirmed by recent DNA work, which has identified a number of haplotypes, Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA haplotypes, which are seeing this early migration around maybe 15, maybe 10,000 years ago, out of Africa, across Asia, and into North America. And these early populations generally thought to be associated with people who were hunting. These are known as the Clovis peoples, who were involved in big game hunting. They were able to, as they came into the Great Plains of North America, were hunted after the large animals that were available for then the end of the last ice age. You'll see in this particular diagram, there's a dotted line on the top there, that map. Can I just explain to the country and realise that's Africa, that's Asia, that's Australia, that's South America, that's North America, that's the Caribbean. So it's a kind of interesting map how the thing has been shown. But you can see there's a dotted line that's taking us across the North Atlantic, and I'll come back to that in a minute because that's also relevant to our story here on Hatteras Island. And these are the kind of sites, so pixelated, of the big game sites with these big animals, mastodons and so forth, with their Clovis points stacked into the side of them. These are also known as Clovis points, and they've got this very simple, very characteristic shape of spearhead, and with a particular type of pressure pointing. And a few years ago, people pointed out the similarity between these Clovis points and a European tradition known as the Solutrean. And there's a group of archaeologists that have argued something called the Solutrean hypothesis, which is that people came from Western Europe to North America, not via Asia, but following the edge of the ice at the end of the last ice age, exploiting the maritime marine resources that were available, just like the Inuit do today. And actually, there's a certain amount of DNA evidence for this. These are two haplotypes, Y chromosome R1 and a mitochondrial DNA haplotype X. And if you can see, but we chose this particularly because they've got a very kind of Algonquian type distribution. You can see how this has essentially a Eurasian distribution, and particularly the female haplotype here has a very much northeast American distribution. So whilst 99% of archaeologists dismiss this idea as fantasy, the genetics is beginning to demonstrate it. And what's quite interesting here is that, of course, if you look at the distribution of the ice at the lake glacier maximum where this migration would happen, of course it would have come ashore here, roughly on Cape Hatteras. There's the distribution of the ice at this point. Okay, here, and of course in that point sea level would have been about 150 metres lower down. So then it's perhaps not surprising that we actually have a Clovis Point here just a few hundred yards away. I'm sorry, it's only a slight small piece. This might be Clovis or more likely Cumberland, which is the next phase on. And there's Scott Dawson standing on where it was found. You'll probably recognise the tree if you live here. It's just very opposite the school in Buxton Village. And this is one that we've seen and we know was found when that tree fell over. What's interesting is that two other Clovis points have been found from dredging a canal right next door to this site. So three Clovis, which I've not seen, they were shown to Dr. Phelps in the 1990s, and God knows where they are now. But three Clovis points, you know, a sight doth make. And I think almost certainly that side, the north side of the road, there may well be a major early Paleo-Indian site, which is really very interesting, really exciting, and might actually throw some light on the argument about the settlement of North America. So there's a really big question there to be answered if we were able to get in there and dig a really big hole. I suspect this Paleo-Indian occupation is really low down. And of course, at that time, and I've stolen this drawing, the whole area would have been very different. The sea level would have been about 50 metres below where we are today, which meant that the Sound was kind of a great river valley. There's an issue of where people are coiling in the Sound to try and reconstruct what the Pamlico Creek might have looked like in the area of the Sound. So this would be very lush, open plain with rivers flowing through it, and with the shoreline, not where the current shoreline is now, but some 5 or 6 miles further out to sea. So you can see a very different kind of place. And since the last ice age, that sea level has increasingly risen. And this also has really interesting implications, which we'll return to here. We know quite a lot about sea level rise along the east coast of North America because particular records have been taken since the 1920s. This is one for Charleston in South Carolina, but it's a very similar message found all the way along the coast, right up as far as New York, in which essentially the rule of thumb, really as far as measurements are concerned, for the last 100 years, is that we're talking about something like a foot every 100 years, something like that. It's like 30 centimetres. Well, you do feet here, don't you, America? So sea level has risen a foot since the 1920s, and as you can see from this diagram, everyone might think about global warming and accelerated rates of sea level rise and so forth. What you're seeing there is a pretty static curve. And this is probably due to a combination of global sea level rises, but also the fact that North America may be ever so slightly tipping into the sea along the eastern seaboard, the geological factor, which means that this is a relatively rate. Now, 1 foot every 100 years is a really fast rate. So if you think about it, so we go back to the time of the Elizabethans, the Roanoke voyages, the Elizabethans coming here to Horton Island around 1500, we're talking about 5 feet difference in that sea level to what it is today. So you can imagine that the sea level has risen, so the Sound would have been 5 feet more shallow than it is today. That doesn't necessarily mean that actually it was actually any shallower, or there was a Sound, because you probably wander around and you think there's not much of the Sound that's going to be much deeper than 5 feet in places. But probably what's happened is there's been silting as the sea level has risen, so the water around has silted, so it probably stayed roughly the same depth. But this has real implications to finding archaeological sites, because many of the sites have probably been buried under the sea or have been taken over and eroded as the sea level, water level has risen and eroded away the sites on the thing. So just go back to the last one, that gives you the global sea level rise here. So at the time of those Cumberland points, you see we're about 40, 50 metres below where we are today. So you can see we do a very different environment in those days. So archaeologists, one of the things archaeologists do is try to work out how environments change over time and how humans have responded to it. That's known as essentially the Paleo-Indian period. We also have quite good representations of the Archaic period, which is a successive time in which we still have hunter-gatherers. We don't have any evidence of farming, but in improved technologies and so forth. For example, we have different types of spear points, and this is one that we've actually excavated from a site in Cave Creek down the end of Rocky Rollinson Road in a residual context, which found in a much later context, but this is what's known as a Savannah River Point from around 1500 BC, something like that. And I've got an even nicer one, thanks to Janet. There's Janet. Hello, Janet. An even nicer one that came to light on Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
Yes, a little Christmas present from Father Christmas for you.
Not promotion.
And this was actually here on Hatteras, or I suppose it is, up at Rodante. And you can see it's a beautiful little Savannah Point, Savannah River Point in Hertfordshire. Very unworn, very nice condition indeed. So that's a new find that came out from the beach, wasn't it? Just eroding out, so it gives you an example where these places are there and they're constantly being found. So if you're walking on the beach and you find an old stone, then this might help rewrite the history of Hatteras Island. So, to just now give you a little bit of a reprise of where we're at in all this, we create these periods. So we're talking about the closed Cumberland period, and then we've then got the Savannah River in the Archaic period. So hunter-gatherers in this part of the world were living till around 1000 to 1500 BC, roughly like that. And then we then have the woodland period. And the woodland period represents the beginning of farming in this area. To basically Native American domesticated crops, some of which have been domesticated in Central America, like corn, for example, probably was domesticated in the Valley of Mexico around 4,000 or 5,000 BC, but other things like various types of squashes and things might have been domesticated more locally. And so we really have a period of farming, of gardening more like, with peoples that are heavily dependent upon hunting and fishing activities on one hand, but also are having a certain amount of agriculture. The early hunter-gatherers are more likely to have been just exploiting and gathering wild berries and things like that, acorns and food resources like that, but by the early woodland period we're beginning to get small husbandry. Now, so far we haven't actually found any early woodland sites, but you know, hold the front page, we might well. We're not totally certain, but it's a relatively short period in this part of coastal Carolinas. We then move into the middle woodland. That's when kind of things begin to get really interesting. And middle woodland sites are often much more substantial, and where we're beginning to find stone tool technology, but also really good evidence of ceramics beginning to appear. And I'll give you a tour of ceramics in a minute. And then in the late woodland period, which is generally referred to as Collington in this part of the world, that really starts in around 800, and this is defined by a type of pottery that has fabric impressions on the surface, and also the heavy use of shell temper in the fabric. And what we've demonstrated here pretty convincingly is that late woodland period, which is essentially Native Americans living here on Hatteras Island, going right the way through into the middle part of the 18th century. So we have uninterrupted and totally obvious indigenous Native American occupation right the way through, probably from the middle woodland right the way through to the latter part or middle part of the 18th century archaeologically. And then there's historical evidence that that Native Americans, a few number of Native Americans survived thereafter. Okay, so that's the basic sequence. We've had a very distinguished visitor, Professor Henry Wright, who I've worked with over the time 20 years in various places around the world, most recently in central Madagascar and places. But Henry, who is probably the foremost ceramicist and survey archaeologist the world popped by, he made a study of the pottery when he was 15 or 14 for a prize essay in this part of the world, and then went off and basically did the archaeology of the rest of the world. He was the archaeologist on National Geographical Society Exploration Committee for 30 years. He'd been awarded a MacArthur, if you know what the MacArthur Scholarship is, fellowship, Henry came by, and 60 years after his earlier attempts to classify pottery as a 15-year-old, he then popped by and sorted out our pottery for us. So there is Henry, hard at work, and to some extent what we do is some of the evidence that we've got. So if we're looking at taking this pottery sequence here, and I should show you a little on the slide, this is how we kind of date the archaeology of where we're working, because what we're doing is we're basically picking up sherds and looking at them in good detail, and that gives us a kind of spot date as to the occupation, the date of the occupation. Then if we then do subsequent excavations and survey, we're then able to get radiocarbon dates and get more material to confirm the chronology precisely. So this is classic middle woodland pottery. This actually doesn't come from here, but the other side of the sound. There's a couple of sherds that Henry brought along to show me that he picked up on the surface collection near Edenton. And what we've got here is this is what's called net impressed pottery. Quite a good evidence, because evidence of net impression here. And you can see this is a really good example here of the net forming on the side there. So these are nets, presumably fishing nets. So an example of how they're actually exploiting the resources. This one is slightly less, more complicated, because it is net impressed, but basically they've rolled the net around a stick or something like that, and so what you're getting is multiple knots here in the rows here, as the thing has been wrapped around a stick, fragment of a net to, decorate the pottery. So good evidence that they had net technology alongside this ceramics. Here's another example of middle and late woodland pottery. You get this paddle stamping design, which is basically a series of grooves put on the end of some sort of stick or other, that's then multiple stamps on top of each other as an intersecting network. So this is probably late middle woodland or early late woodland. But you can see all these middle woodland pottery all has sand temper to it. It doesn't have shell temper, which is a good characteristic. And then we then get into the middle woodland, we get into the late woodland, and this is stuff that we dug up yesterday. You can see it's a completely different kind of stuff, really. And you can see it's covered in huge quantities of this great chunky shell temper. This is quite a late example of it. And you can see also, so I flashed it, so you can't basically, you can see the fabric impression on the outsides of the sherds. So this is actually classic Collington pottery from 800, 1000 AD, right the way through, probably to the end of 1750 or whatever. Okay, so the main sites that we found are here. And they basically, there's a nice air photo of where we are. We're kind of up by Hatteras Village, really, aren't we? Far end. So we're looking down, and these islands here, these islands are probably what remains of the inlet that's shown on the map drawn by John White in 1585. And what we're looking at is the Hatteras Island itself. The most famous site, which has been known about since the 1930s, is the Cape Crete site, which is in here. And we've been excavating mostly this area here. and it's been known about for a long time. When we first started work, we did have another site up here called the Jeanette Creek site, which is up here next to this other canal. And then we're also working at the school, the secondary school, and then Frisco is another site which is not much left of Frisco, and then Hatteras Village, we haven't really done much work there. We're hoping to do some exploration there this season, but it's been raining, hasn't it? And weather has been lying. We're going to say low lying. It's all would been underwater really, so we haven't really been able to get at the key deposits that we might otherwise have wanted to do. So a quick kind of distribution map. I put Civil War on just for fun as well. Quick distribution map of some of these sites. So if we now, as it were, go back, we do have, we're very fortunate to have a really accurate ethno-historical record of the people who lived here on this island. Because this was the place that was probably first contacted when the Elizabethans, the Elizabethan expeditions sponsored by Sir Walter Raleigh came here, first in 1584, and then in 1585, and then 1587. And there's quite good evidence to suggest that even that first expedition, 1584, might actually have made its landfall here on Hatteras Island. People dispute that, and they put it various other places, up at Woodante and all sorts of other places. But I think the reading of the Barlow account would suggest that they came here. But most interestingly, the 1585 expedition, for which this map and various other ones has been produced. This is by a map drawn up by Thomas Harriot, one of the foremost mathematicians of his age, who accompanied the expedition, and we have these wonderful descriptions by John White, drawings of what the conditions were here as part of that expedition. And what we have is, and I've chosen this particular because it actually shows you where the Native American villages are, and they're marked rather nicely on red here. You can see that there's Suckertown, for example, the village here, Homerak, another village located here, and then there's another village on the end of Roanoke Island, for example. Not quite sure they're living on those islands, but they might have been. But the most interesting thing is you can see from that map that the majority of the population at this moment of contact, 1585, is here on Croatoan Island or Hatteras Island. And you can see a series of dots here that seem to represent Native American villages. So if we do a close-up, we try and kind of work out what's going on in terms of the topography. That's a 1585 map showing the inlet, and here is Hatteras Island, and you can kind of begin to sort of count bumps, if you like. Personally, I think that's probably that bump there. It's actually a remarkably accurate map. This bump here represents Hatteras village here, and there's certainly a big site just there. In fact, there was a big ossuary found in the 1990s. A Native American ossuary with some just over 112 individuals buried within it. So we know that's a major site here. And if you then go up, the next bump might well be here, which is Frisco. Then we then have another bump, which I think is probably largely gone, which is where the school is, here. And then we then go down and have another bump, which is then the Cape Creek site. So this description is really remarkably good drawing of the island. It's a little fatter. Heavens knows, maybe it was narrow in those days, and we know how much, particularly the whole area down at Cape Hatteras, has changed since the 15th century, 16th century. So just remind you, because I'm sure this is well known to all of you, these wonderful drawings that we've got. I mean, that's the scene probably sitting out, looking out at Cape Creek, looking out at Rocky Rollins and across the Sounds. This is what it would have looked like. It's just an extraordinary drawing that shows all the wildlife and the animals and so forth beautifully observed, the fishing traps they're using, the type of boat, You see the fish that's laden in the canoes there. They're spearing the fish, and they're using a whole range of implements and so forth to collect the fish. Here you can see the basket traps and so forth. Then also you can see the birds beautifully described in the sky, flying around. So they were clearly new. So you've got a complete wonderful environment there encapsulated in that picture. And on the right is the, fortunately they never drew the village here, as he must have stayed or stayed next to, but he did describe the island of Secreton, the village of Secreton, which is on the mainland opposite here. You can see the kinds of houses and so forth. Now this is often repeated ad nauseam in every book about Native Americans, even today. And there's often this image of what happens here on Hatteras Island, or in the realms, is then created almost as the model for describing the whole of Native American culture and the whole of Eastern America. If you buy any book on the subject, you'll see one of these images on the front cover. Very beautiful, but actually, they're all here. And actually, how typical they were of anywhere else, we don't really know. But it does show this wonderful landscape, rich and replete of resources. And indeed, that's exactly what our archaeology has confirmed. Some of the images of the Native Americans themselves. We also have, alongside those extraordinary drawings, this narrative compiled by Thomas Harriot, a brief and true report of the Newfound land of Virginia, which gives this unbelievable close description. And that was, when it was published, printed a few years later, includes versions of the white drawings, some of which seem to include images that were otherwise not, that haven't survived in the original collection. So there might have been more that haven't survived, which were then turned into woodcuts by Thomas de Bray. So they give you a wonderful, wonderful description of what's here. So it's possible to reconstruct that basic topography of where all these islands and where all these settlements were. But it's quite clear that this particular island was a major centre of Native American Algonquin culture at this moment of English contact. So I shall just skip those. Okay, so let's just go to the earliest bit, Middle Woodland, and this is a site at Frisco, which is our best Middle Woodland site, or was our best Middle Woodland site, until it all got built over, smashed up, and so forth. It was a wonderful, complete, surviving midden that survived until 2 years ago, and then someone built a house on top of it and bulldozed it all the way. But what survives, we were able to get in and dig one test pit on the site and get a really nice collection of pottery and also shell from the site. So we've got a small sample, it's a massive site. There may well be more material there. If you go there, you'll see shells absolutely everywhere. It's really sad. But there's clearly a lot more information that could have been derived from that site, but has now been lost. So this is what some of the ceramics look like. And you can see that it's rather characteristic and rather fine net impressed paddle. Actually, that's paddle impressed pottery, also net impressed pottery, then a bit of fabric impressed pottery. But it's not, none of it's actually sand tempered. Some of it's shell tempered. It's very different to what we're finding elsewhere on the site. And there's the kind of shells, some of which just the midden just consisted of oyster shells, which is maybe quite an interesting seasonal indicator for the time in which the site is being inhabited. I'm not quite sure what these holes are, but it might have demonstrated might have been reused in some way or another. So hold the front pages. This is the next site. I've popped in one image because we're digging it as we speak. So this is the school site where we opened 2 days ago, and we're currently excavating it. Yeah, we have. There you are. Hello, hi. A member of the audience. There we go. I didn't choose it on purpose, I promise you. And this, it seems to be. We haven't done fully washed the pottery yet, but it seems to be probably early, late woodland in date, so sort of 800, 1000 AD, maybe something like that. We're not quite sure of the date, we haven't fully identified, we obviously haven't got radiocarbon dates. But the school site probably is a very big and was originally a very complex site, although much of it has been destroyed in the 1980s when the school was constructed. But there were fragments left around the site which allows us to get at various bits and pieces from it. So if you're not from is it Munchkin's Academy? We've got our eyes on that. The TV tots and the Methodist, how many Methodists here? We've got eyes on the Methodist Church, as well as the school itself. Okay, so but the most interesting sequence comes really from the later part of the late woodland period, and here we found an extraordinary site, which probably dates to the middle part of the 16th century, 1550 to 1600, which those who want to seek for lost colonies will get extremely excited about, because this is actually the period of that contact. So what we've got here on this site is the material culture, if you like, of that European contact. And it's a really complicated site. We'll go into a bit more detail on Friday. But what we found was numerous post holes, something like 500 post holes, and this season we've extended it here, so there's another section of the site coming down here where post holes have continued in large quantities. These are probably the remains of what often referred to as longhouses. This is from Pomerac on the mainland, the other side of the Sound, but you can get the idea of multiple constructions of flimsily constructed buildings. Another wonderful white drawings. Or if you ever go to historic Jamestown, you'll see that attempts have been made to reconstruct them. So you can see that what we're looking at there is remains of multiple rebuildings of these kind of houses at this particular spot. And what we're actually finding is fascinating evidence, if you like, of the way of life of these inhabitants at exactly this moment of European contact. So I just snapped this afternoon as one of our typical finds trays to give you an idea of kind of what comes out. So we have shell, bird bone, carbon, pottery. You can see the shell pottery in there and there and there. Fishbone in there. That's probably mostly it. Very little, a little bit of European material, so I'll come back to in a minute. There's also this sort of fascinating assemblage of everything there. And locked up in all that is a lot of information about how people were living and when they were occupying the resources that they were exploiting. And what we're beginning to find from our sites, first of all, is that people probably lived here all year round on Hatteras Island. Some people have claimed, most of the National Park Service, I believe, that the island was only briefly occupied on a seasonal basis. But what we're actually finding as we're moving around these sites that the environmental evidence is changing, but representing how people are exploiting it at different times as at different places, so different types of resources. So, for example, this is a particularly nice group of material. This is fish bones. That came out. Rosie, when was that? Was that one from yesterday?
Yesterday, yeah.
Yesterday's fish bones for you. And at the moment we're just sorting them to fish species, but we haven't managed to drill down to particular attributes. But I snapped the other picture there. There you are from the nice chart. I'm sure you've got what's on your walls as good local fishermen. Know what type of fish are available at which time of year. So if we're able to identify the fish species that we get from the bone evidence, and it's possible to do so, then we might be able to work out the season in which that particular assemblage of fish bones was collected. So seasonality, seasonal indicators are a really important thing of what we're trying to do. This is, for example, a midden in the process of excavation, and the black soil is coming out. You can see this mass of shells, one on top of another. Well, you remember that, Millie? Is that your bottom by any chance? That was taken 3 days ago, excavating out the base of the shell midden. So again, the shells provide you. Hi. So the shells also provide you with a really good seasonal indicator, and that's what we've been working today with the school kids, who've just arrived, something at the secondary school, to provide, because you know how you have scallops at one time of year, and clams at another time of year, and conches at another time of year, and so forth. So if you could, through these deposits, we get thick deposits of shell, do different counts of the shells involved, then we can get some indication of what time of year that midden was created. But also you've got the potential, because we've there got a lovely assemblage of shells from a particular moment in time in the 16th century. So well actually how much does the size of those scallops, for example, change since the 16th century today? So we can say things about the conservation of maritime resources and so forth over time, whether people have been over-exploiting the shellfish or under-exploiting the shellfish, whether they got bigger, they got smaller, and so forth. So really interesting questions related to that. They also like their turtle, and of course they're a famous resource here on the Outer Banks, and we have turtle bone from virtually every context, I think, don't we? Whereas if you have turtle from every layer?
Pretty much, yeah.
So there's a selection of turtle bone. So I think that they're not just exploiting turtles when they're most vulnerable, when they're coming ashore to lay eggs, but they may be exploiting turtle more widely, which demonstrates maybe the type of technology that they had in order to fish turtle. They're also using the woods extensively, and so here we've got some of the animal bone. There's a deer bone, virtually all deer bone found, that overwhelmingly, presumably from those arrowheads and so forth that we see and have been collected from time to time on the island, and the woods here would have been full of game. But we also find other examples, other fish, other bone that suggests that they're exploiting. For example, we've got a squirrel bone, I think, did it be?
Yeah, sure.
A squirrel jaw, for example, suggests that they might have been hunting squirrels, and been hunting anything that moved. But perhaps one of the most remarkable finds in the last few days is this lot, which are bird bones. And one particular deposit was absolutely full of bird bones. And you can tell they're bird bones because they've got these nice hollow shafts. And maybe they're being netted as there are seasonal migrations coming through the island. And then maybe as they're coming down, landing here or in the swamps at the back of the island to feed, and the sort of sitting target, literally, to come over and net them, throw nets over them, and get good meat that way. We don't know which species they were, so I'll be very grateful if anyone has any idea what species we should go and look for. What nice big, fat, plump, sort of goose-like sized birds come here and feed here in the winter in their seasonal migrations. But also, if they're coming through the winter, it's really interesting because that means we can begin to pick up these seasonal things that maybe they're doing the deer at one time of year, the scallops, the nets, they're doing the deer the next, and so forth, and birds. And this is what they're hunting them with. This is what's called the Jack's Point. And wow, that's a very nice example of one of these late woodland asymmetrical spears. It's not. They've actually taken. They are actually shaped like that. They are actually. It is actually. It's a Jack's Reef point, and it is actually asymmetrical. It doesn't look like taking the picture as an angle. We get a little bit of evidence of European contact here in these levels. I think these are the sum total of the number of trade beads we found. despite meticulous sieving, vast quantities of material, these are basically only 2 beads we've got. But we have been looking at the copper. And here we are, we've got a wonderful expensive machine here, courtesy of Booker. Charlie, looking at analysing this is an XRF machine, X-ray diffraction fluorescence, X-ray fluorescence machine, a little portable machine, and there we are actually, comes up with the, Charlie will tell you all the details later. But kindly dangerous by Booker, only a £50,000 machine, but it does mean that we can do the analysis here. Normally you take them off island and do the analysis in very expensive laboratories. Now the technology has become so portable that we can do it here on our kitchen table. Literally. These are the kinds of things that we're finding, this is brass, actually, we've got a nice percentage here, 71% copper, 40% zinc, 1.4% iron, 1.3% lead. So that kind of looks like a brass, doesn't it? But it's being fashioned in a way that Native Americans might use it, and clearly this is therefore a trade item that they've acquired. This is a ring that we found in the same deposit, which is again 7% zinc. So it's a brass ring, which again from that deposit. So they are trading now. Whether this represents the point in which this is a post-Jamestown settlement, or whether this is material that's coming through trade in the Spanish and other groups, we really don't know. But we hope to find out. And again, this is a range of nice artefacts that again, we thought were copper, but they've got quite lots of zinc in them, so again, they're almost certainly traded items that have come to the settlement in one way or another. And this is the bit that I like most of all. I'm totally bemused by what it might be, but it turned out to be brass. I think it's a porthole myself. A little porthole that be salvaged and reused, maybe a rim to a barrel or something like that, but probably something maritime. I think it has a certain thing about it that's then been reused by the local population. So by the late 16th century, people are beginning to become assimilated into a wider world economy. So we just move the story on. I want to now talk briefly about the next site, which is at Jeanette Creek, which we excavated a few years ago. And here you can see the same telltale story of the big midden here, and you can just see how localised they are in distribution. And in this deposit, we're probably now moving into the early part of the 17th century. 1620, 1630, something like that. And particularly two interesting pieces of pottery here. On the right, we've got absolute this classic Collington type pottery with a big, thick shell temper. But on the left is a piece which we originally thought, oh gosh, this must be a sand-tempered piece from somewhere in the interior. It has its mending holes, it's obviously very precious. And we think this is a piece of what's known as colonograph. This is pottery that's being produced probably by Native American potters up in Chesapeake for trade with the Native American communities around. But it's coming within a colonial context. It has no decoration, it's very different to the later pottery. But it could also be made a bit later on, also by the early slaves that are being introduced to the region. But we've got nice spear points again continuing, a lot of pipes. These are again so people are smoking. You know, so you see a little pipe there in position, found in the midst of one of these rather shell middens. The pipes on the right are rather curious. The identical pipes have actually been found in the excavations at Roanoke. They're probably Native American, but they could have been produced in colonial But we also find imported pipes, like this. This is a Bristol clay pipe from around 1640. So this is a site, I think, that belongs to that period, the early half of the 17th century. And then we move a little bit back to Cape Creek. So you can see that probably they're kind of living on their own mess. And they're moving around, thinking, oh, I've got too smelly now, let's move to another creek, and then back again. And this is a well-known site that was excavated by David Phelps in the 1990s. That got everyone totally excited that maybe the survivors of the lost colony had indeed turned up onto Hatteras Island. And two pieces of really key evidence were adduced for this. The first was this, which is a snap-ons, a gun lock mechanism, which is Elizabethan, but also goes on to the Jacobean period. This is really before they actually had gun flints, but instead were using lighted match to fire the guns, a rather old-fashioned technology. And secondly, so the colours have gone on because it was stolen off the internet, the famous Kendall ring, which is meant to represent the coat of arms of a man called Master Kendall, who was on the expedition in 1585. But in this case was found very worn out, had been turned into a pendant. Now the problem was that, okay, the ring might be from that, but who knows what it is really. The snap-ons actually carry on being produced well into the 17th century and were largely being traded to the Native Americans because they were perceived to be too useless. So exactly the kind of thing. So it's not really the smoking gun that everyone wants. And were found associated with a couple of coins minted by Charles II. That's post-1668, I think, that particular coin is there. So we're into the latter part of the 17th century. And we were able to excavate alongside that plot, in the plot owned by the Cook family, and this is the excavation here. So the Phelps excavation is in there. Here we are alongside. You see a series of test pits there that we were able to excavate. And here we've got, again, lovely nice midden deposits, and it started to rain, as it did. It always does in this place, the water level comes up. But what we had in those levels were this, which gives you a nice date of 1648. So exactly contemporary really with the felt stuff, the other side of the fence, if you like. This is a coin weight. This is the kind of thing that people would have in their back pocket to make sure that the coins weren't being debased. So it was minted. This is the merchant who sold the weight and whose reputation it led, that he produced in 1648. And this is the coin that it was meant to be verifying the date of 1644. That's why you've got the two different dates. So, really nice date. How something got there. But also in those same levels we find these, which are called tidewater pipes from the Chesapeake area, very similar to the colonial work being produced maybe by Native Americans under a colonial regime with these very nice types of decoration. But by this point they've also got firearms, vast quantities of shot come out from the archaeology, and lots of flint, and you can virtually date a site by the amount of shell, the amount of beads you get. So suddenly, rather than just one or two, literally thousands or hundreds of beads. They're all tiny, and as those who have to spend their time on the wet sieve residue will know, very difficult to see. Mixed in with all that shell, you can see that they are often 1 or 2 millimetres in size. So we just finished the story of the last excavation, kind of not quite the last excavation, which was a remarkable piece of archaeology really, on this site, on the edge of this site, another massively thick midden deposit, and here it is, and you can see that it consists of dinner. In fact, it was a bloody great big party, probably thick with shell, and you can see vast quantities of turtle bone. And that actually, here it all. So that little 2x1 excavation, it produced that amount of turtle bone, which, come on Rosie, give me the stats.
55 turtles.
55 turtles. How many thousand bones?
A lot.
A lot. So that, presumably that's one event, and they literally had just this enormous, great big turtle feast. This kind of thing, presumably, you could do with nesting turtles at a particular time of year, and just come in and club them all to death and have an enormous turtle feast. So some major event might have happened as part of that. So this seems to date to around 1700, judging by the clay pipes we found and the brandy bottles that we found in the same levels associated with it. So this kind of represents maybe the end of, as it were, traditional Native American society. And then what's interesting is directly on top of those Native American sites, or just a few feet away, we then find the first consistent evidence of what might have had pioneer colonial occupation. So here we have a pit with a brandy bottle in the bottom of it, which actually set directly over that earlier 16th century site I showed you, said brandy bottle. But this is a particularly good one. This is a pioneer house. There's the wall trench of that particular house, and it was built of daub. And here's the daub itself. So this is right on, this is the Jeanette Creek site. This is just a few feet away from that Indian midden. And here we've got this wonderful salt grey stoneware bowl set into the daub wall of the structure. That salt grey stoneware dates about 1720, 1730, something like that. And all this nice European slipware and German stoneware, at which point the Native American pottery virtually tails off. It's virtually visible, and all you get in these early pioneer sites is European imports. To what extent there was intermarriage and intermixing between those European pioneers coming here in the 1720s, 1730s, and the native communities that were living on the same site or very close, I can't answer, logically, I'm afraid. But what is really interesting is that the closeness of those two communities is really very striking indeed, very interesting, very obvious. So I think I've just about covered 10,000 years. We won't do the 19th century because that's really boring. The 20th century is even more boring, and we're only just in the 21st century. But I was just going to finish with one image, which kind of says, and it just makes two things, 2 points. This is looking now into the future, next 10,000 years, next 5,000 years. So this is what's going to happen to you with global warming and sea level rise in the next 50 years. You'll be glad to hear that the main part of Hatteras Island is actually going to survive. Little bits of Rodanti maybe. A tiny bit of Avon. And where we're planning your new ocean centre? Here I go. But to just give you an idea about how the environment's changed, but also makes a serious point that actually the thing that's always continuous on this place is Hatteras Island. The banks, after banks have moved and changed, but actually Hatteras Island is the one bit that has remained stable, and that's hardly surprising that it has all this archaeology in it. And then if we then go into sort of 100 years' time, don't buy houses in Rodanti. Again, here's the island was always there. So this is, I suppose, a story of the differences, the challenges that we've got, and I hope that I kind of make the message that archaeologists aren't just sort of looking at sort of backward-looking curiosities in the past and so forth, but actually trying to tell a story, help understand how man can kind of sustainably live in a place like this, and has done successfully over 10,000 years, and presumably how it can continue to do so for maybe another 10,000 years. Thank you. Right. Mr. Park. Any questions? Maggie, explain. You're the secretary.
Well, okay. I mean, basically, the Horton Archaeological Society is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We're in our 5th year of doing our annual spring excavation, and like I said, we're currently doing a dig with the secondary school, but we're also doing our regular sites as well. Not a whole lot to say. We do archaeological digs here on Hatteras, and that's pretty much it.
Yes, and you have a Facebook page?
We have a Facebook page, we have a website, we have some information up here if anybody is interested in being a part of the society. We have membership forms here. You can join tonight. I've got my little thing to do the PayPal thing on the phone. If somebody wants to join, you can just swipe it, or you can do cash or check. But we also have our information about our organization up here, and event flyer if you're interested in coming to the talk Friday night in Avon at Firehouse. So, am I missing something, Jen? I wasn't planning on talking. I have another board member here, so
You're good. You're good.
so basically, yeah, we're just.
We have.
And we should say that we have a display screen. Should we say a little bit about the display screen? Okay, so we've got a touch screen. It's just gone up this afternoon, this evening, yes, which says some of the things I've been saying on this talk, with some of the objects that we've been finding. And Yang, where's Yang? Hello, she's done a fantastic job producing it.
And also a couple of the artifacts that are back here were actually on his presentation. We didn't plan that, but that worked out really well. One of the native pot rims is on the top. Some of the whelk shells that the natives used as tools for gardening or scraping out the logs to make canoes are back there, and those were actually found in context. We know they were used. You can see where they were worn down on the bottom side. We have a bodrel stone back there, which was what the natives used. They held the stone, and then they had their stick where they would use it to make their fire. So it holds the stick in place. And then we have the Savannah River Point back there, the Jack Reeves Point, and then a few microliths, which are also from archaic times. So we'll get that. Touch screen, I guess we'll turn on back there. So, yes. So if anybody is interested in becoming a member of the society, just let me know. I'll be with all the stuff here.
And volunteers, come digging. But not this year, because we're pretty well
We're
done.
just about done this year, but if you want to dig with us in future years, just talk to me about joining. We'd love to have you. And yeah.
And if anybody wants to come and see some more exhibits about ecology and history, not quite as ancient as this, next door will be open for a while yet. We've got a bunch of touchscreen displays in there.
And it actually is very interesting because I've walked around over there and done the touch screen. So it's very cool if y'all get a chance to walk through there. So. Are there any questions for him? No?
I've been the park.
I have a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm just kind of curious. This is really fascinating stuff, and we have all this history. How come it takes somebody coming over from the UK to educate Americans about where we're living? What's the deal with that?
Well, I'm not sure really.
And do you have any colleagues who you partner with here in the States?
Not really.
That's really bizarre, it seems.
Well, I suppose, let's just say that I'm a global archaeologist. I work, around the world. But I also make sure wherever I work with the local community as a community-based archaeology. And one of the fundamental rules that I have wherever I work is I never take stuff away. We do all the analysis, we do all the field work, we do all the lab work in where we're working. If I'm working in Madagascar or something, it's illegal to take stuff out, so it's a practical thing, but also an ethical thing as well. And I think that there has been quite a long history of work here on the island by Phillips, ECU and others. But what's tended to happen in the past is American universities have come in here and taken everything away. And because the hurricanes will destroy everything, and then it never comes back, it sits in university labs and then gets dispersed and so forth. So I suppose one of the fundamental reasons why we kind of be welcomed is because we want to give back the history here. We don't want to take away the history of Hatteras Island. We wanted to stay here on the island for as a resource for the island, educational resource, as a touristic resource, as a cultural resource. And I think what we really want to do is to make sure that we've got this, we can tell this amazing story somewhere on the island that people can actually come to visit and enjoy. But also people living on the island to hear about it and understand this incredible heritage that's here on this small patch of sand.
It's amazing.
It is just amazing. It's world-class stuff. Yeah.
How did you start here? I mean, how did you pick it?
Well, we were invited over. Scott and Maggie. And we came over and done a few rolls and thought, wow, that's exciting.
So, but you're not sure whether it was seasonal dwelling at certain periods, right? In that woodland, you're not sure whether it was seasonal or they lived here all year round.
Well, archaeology is a really difficult and complex process, as you can imagine. And what we're doing is we're sampling, we're kind of dipping our toes in little bits and getting, because there's just so much data that it's really difficult to, we can't dig everywhere. So what we're doing is picking up little snippets and then hopefully get them dated properly so we can work out. But my gut reaction is that people are living here all year round. But what they're doing is they're exploiting different resources. So if you just look at one side, you think, they're just here to exploit the clams, or they're just here to exploit the turtles. But actually, the totality of it suggests that they are probably exploiting everything. And you can live here all year round. Great.
Extraordinary amount of work that you've done here in the last 7 years. How is this all paid for?
Maggie, how's it paid for? With difficulty, I think it's fair to say.
It's still being paid for.
Both answers are correct.
Yes.
If somebody wants to know the specific answer, so essentially, we are a nonprofit organization. So as all nonprofit organizations, we're always broke. So there's always kind of somebody who's funneling something in, and that would be kind of me and Scott for the most part, and then we try to reimburse ourselves as much as possible. But we do get donations from corporate sponsors, and I need to thank my board members, especially, they have really worked hard to help us get us some corporate sponsors. And but then also we did get a grant this year from the Outer Banks Community Foundation, small grant, $2,000, which did help a little bit, for a portion of it. So they're a great organization. Go hit like on their Facebook page because they want Hatteras Island to be more involved with them. And but other than that, it's membership fees. It's a big piece of that. So again, back to if you want to be a member, just let me know. And or if you're a business owner or want to be a corporate sponsor, we like that too. Just let us know. But so pretty much we've got small budget, small income, and we just do our best to put the money all together.
I'm sorry, do you mean to tell me that this marvelous work is being done without any federal government money or state government money, that this is completely supported from this community?
Yes. Basically.
So how can one go about advocating for federal and state monies? Had you done it? Have you researched grants?
Exactly. How do we go about doing that?
Someone asked, why does it take a team from England to come out here and do this work? It's because there is no state or federal money for this sort of work. This work stands out in North Carolina. I can think of one other group in North Carolina that's doing this remarkable level of work on a site of international significance, and because it's supported by the community and it's led by local community leaders. If you were waiting for the federal government to fund this sort of work, the work center doesn't happen.
What's wrong?
But the initiative is come from this community.
If you involve a federal agency, grant writer, etc., then you get involved with stuff being taken away, right?
That's right.
Yes.
Let's give you an example. A token a Nuremberg token that was found in the 1930s, is sitting, we don't know where, in some store in Florida. And nobody will own up to it, nobody will let us see it, nobody will, know where it is.
That's right,
So you have to tread carefully where you do your funding.
I mean, I think the other thing is, the other obvious way where we've also steered clear of is kind of media money. Because, there's obviously lovely stories to be had about, lost colonies and all this kind of thing, that will spice it all up, but would necessarily devalue the quality of the science that we're trying to do, and sensationalise it all. And just spoil it, and they'll just want us to find, Virginia Pinky Ring or whatever.
that's the only thing they want. Yeah, they forget about the native people.
So we're very keen to not sell ourselves out to National Geographic, History Channel, or anybody else like that. And then, again, my experience, because I do masses of television myself, is that ultimately, ultimately, TV just is out there to make money, is not there to help projects, It's parasitic. That's us.
Thank you so
That's
much.
pleasure.